Well. Here we are again. It is week 2 of Newsshooter Weekly, and I think we're settling into our new day and time of Wednesdays at 4:30 p.m. Pacific. And I lied last week because look who's here with Matt and I. It is Erik Naso. And welcome, gentlemen. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Actually, this is not Eric. This is Jack, his evil twin. So he will have a very unusual attitude today, different than Eric, which is so much more laid back.
And you, Matt, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Good to see everybody again. We made it to second episode, so that's one thing, I guess. Pretty busy on the site this week. Lots of gear announcements and lots for us to talk about today.
Good. And I am the alter ego of Jem Schofield. I am Jem Schoenfeld. So welcome to Newsshooter Weekly. Before we get into stuff, I would like to, because we're still only on episode 2, for the people who are showing up and watching the show, just have a brief intro from both of you gentlemen. So we've obviously known each other for a long time, but people who are tuning into Newsshooter Weekly, Matt, if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do when you're not doing stuff with Newsshooter.
Sure, I'm a freelance director of photography based out of Tokyo, Japan. I've been in this industry for 31 years now, so I specialize in doing documentaries, TV shows, corporate work, some sort of short films, commercials, that sort of thing. So that's basically what I do.
Great. And Eric, tell us about yourself.
Well, when I'm out washing cars or picking up trash along the highway, I work at NBC7 and I work for the Creative Services Department. So basically my product is the news product. That's what I do. I basically make commercials and image spots for the station. And when, that kind of slows down around 6 o'clock at night, I start pounding the keyboards and writing articles and doing reviews for newsshooter.com.
Awesome. So if you want to know a little bit more about both Eric and Matt, please tune into last week's episode because we went in a little bit more in depth to a couple of projects that both had been working on recently. And today, I think the next thing that we want to do is first kind of give you a sense of the format here. Basically, this is Eric and Matt's show. I am just the host and the moderator, so I'm serving up information for the boys to chat about and go over. There will be a chat live for the show, which I will be checking out and trying to pull some questions from. If you have a specific question for the show, please put @Newsshooter before the question. That helps me tremendously when I'm looking for those things. And I would like to, if it's okay with both you, Eric and Matt, first start by talking a little bit about a couple of things that are not that S5 camera from Panasonic. So I'm going to bring up this image of this new lens that was announced by Fujinon today, or by Fuji. And any thoughts on this that you gentlemen want to, tell us about? Go for it.
This is following on from the previous two Premista lenses that were announced last year. So this is basically the wide angle to complement the other two lenses in the series. Similar size and weight, just a little bit shorter, but the gear positions are all in the exact same spot as the other two lenses. This has basically been designed for a need because as we've been moving to large format sensors and beyond, there's a need for zoom lenses. There's lots of primes out there, but there's very few full frame cinema zoom lenses available, and particularly at the wide end. So this is meant for operators of Steadicams, Trinities to put on cranes, car rigs, things along those lines. And it fills a gap for Fujinon. They're trying to recreate, a full frame zoom series that's very similar to what they did previously with some of their lineup, including the Cabrio lenses that were all S35 based. So, this is not going to be a cheap lens. Again, this is probably going to be a rental only item. It'll probably come in around about the $40,000 mark, but it now gives, Fujinon a range there between 19 all the way up to 250 mil, which is, pretty good, and it's going to cover a lot. 19 doesn't sound overly wide, but on a full frame sensor, it is really wide, particularly if you start shooting in some of the wide modes on some cameras like the Venice and the Red Monstro VistaVision. You're going to get a very wide equivalent field of view that you would normally get on, say, APS-C with, say, like 11 or 12 mil lens. So the benefit of that is being at 19 on a full frame camera is you're not going to get that distortion that's normally typically associated with wide focal lengths on APS-C size sensors.
Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Eric? Any thoughts on this lens coming to market?
Yeah, it looks like Matt said. It looks like they're rounding up that set. So it's always great to have a set of zooms you're going to use together, obviously, and with it all lining up correctly, it's going to make it a lot faster to swap out lenses. And like Matt said, also 19 on a full frame sensor is going to be pretty nice. So this will definitely be a popular lens in that lineup. And I wish I had 2 or 3 of them just to kick around.
I think it's a great range. I mean, 19 to 45, that can be a workhorse and really nice on a full frame. We do these things. They're called shout outs, I guess. We've got Film Convert here in the chat. Chris Cohn, we've got Colin, Shazam, the iPad producer, Benjamin, digital filmmaker. So welcome to the show. Glad to have you here. And first question, what do you guys think about the DZOFilm's S35 Pictor lenses? I know nothing about them. Are you familiar, either of you? Eric, you're not in your head. I'm going full screen with you. It's all about you. Go ahead. Tell us what you got.
Well, no, actually, I should be getting the set here pretty soon. I was been communicating with them, and they're excited about sending it out for a review. I'm very excited to play with these because these are really affordable lenses, and it's very tough to get zooms in that range being affordable. So I'm excited about them. I think the early reports out there's some folks that got some pre-release versions seem to be pretty happy with them. So it's a good time. Cameras are developing, and so are lenses. Now, cinema lenses, I mean, they're really kind of coming into that price range, while still very high, a whole lot more affordable, and might even make you want to buy as opposed to rent if you need, cinema style zoom lenses that are parfocal.
So are these falling into the same price range as the Fujinons, like the MKX lenses and their E-mount versions, the 18 to 55, 50 to 135, or are they even more reasonable in price than those? Do you know?
I believe, now I might be wrong, but I believe the set is like a little over $5,000. So that's nuts.
The set. Okay.
I think you can get 2 of them for like $5,000.
Okay.
I'd have to look it up real quick because I didn't have.
Yeah, somebody's actually bringing. Okay, it's there's a link up here that's being posted by Newsshooter. So there's some info on there, and it's a 20 to 55. T2, it looks like T28, and then a 50 to 125 T28. Interesting. Okay, so similar focal range to what we get with the Fujinons, but it sounds like Benjamin is saying in the chat the set's about $4,500 US. So
yeah, see, wow, under $5,000 for a set is amazing.
Yeah, so not quite half the cost of the Fujinons, but we'll see how those are pretty phenomenal little lenses in terms of image quality you get with them. Okay, great. Any thoughts on that those lenses at all, Matt? Anything for you?
I think it's interesting that we're still seeing a lot of people bringing out S35 glass, particularly zooms, and also a few primes are coming out as well. I mean, with this big push towards larger sensors and use of full frame cameras, you would think that maybe people wouldn't be designing or building S35 glass. But the benefit of S35 glass is obviously focal length in terms of reach and size and weight. You can obviously make the lens a lot smaller than a full frame lens, particularly when it comes to cinema style lenses. So that's the big thing. And a lot of people are still shooting in S35 modes, particularly if you're doing sort of documentary work or anything that requires a bit of length with your lenses. Having an S35 lens is advantageous in a lot of regards.
Yeah, and Benjamin's saying that unless you want white, then over $5,000 US. I guess if you're trying to match them with the Stormtrooper Komodo camera, then you get them for $4,500. But if you want a
Yeah.
different color, I'm assuming black, then it'll be over 5,000. I don't know. That's just the data that's coming in through the chat.
Yeah. We're seeing so
lens
many good
mounts?
lenses also
Yeah.
coming out of China, which is also, that's most of the lenses come out of Japan and Germany. And to seeing the Chinese market really, creating their own optics now, and they're getting so much better. Didn't really see a whole lot, especially in the cinema world, cinema lenses. So it's interesting to see them getting competitive in there.
Yeah. Any thoughts on? So Venus Optics, their Laowa lenses are somewhat unique. They seem to be sort of going down their own path. They're not necessarily following what other people are. They kind of remind me of, Fujifilm that way in terms of the way they're going down the path with their cameras. They're doing, not that nobody has an APS-C camera, but they're doing that, and they're doing medium format, and they're in kind of their own lane. Any thoughts on the Laowa lenses? I've used some of them. Have either of you used any of their lenses, even if it's just to bring them in for reviews?
Yeah, I've shot with quite a few of their lenses, including the probe lens, the 12mm ultra wide, and the 25 to 100 zoom. And as you said, Jem, they're going down their own path, and I think that's an interesting thing to do because the market is saturated with lens choices. So to stand out, you need to try and make something or do something different from everybody else. So if you create sort of these, in some cases, niche lenses, then you're making yourself stand out from other companies. And optically, they're pretty good. I was pretty impressed by the zoom. Actually stands for out of our minds, a marketing thing again that Laowa is doing to distinguish themselves from other people. But that's a proper purpose-built cine lens that is reasonably priced and offers pretty good performance. It's got more of a sort of a vintage look than a lot of other lenses, and it's not quite that sharp when it's wide open, and it's a lot better optically wider and at the mid focal lengths than it is once you get out towards the end of its focal range. It does start to get a little bit soft, but again, you can't expect performance in a $5,000 lens to mimic that of a $10,000 lens, but that's a really good alternative to say a Zeiss 21 to 100, or some of the other options like the Canon 30 to 105. For a lot less money. So we're starting to see these lenses come out again from other companies that you normally wouldn't probably associate, lenses from coming with, particularly out of China and places like that, where they're doing a pretty good job. I mean, you're never going to get, $20,000 performance for $5,000, but you can get a decent result for not a lot of money. And if you want to move from stills lenses and jump into cine style lenses, then you don't want to spend a fortune because it's a giant jump up from a stills lens to a cine lens. So to be able to get something that's sort of that in between is a good stepping stone for people.
And they also have that adapter, right? It's like an anamorphic adapter that goes in the back as well as a doubler. I mean, that's super innovative design-wise to be able to turn the into an anamorphic lens.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a rear 1.33 times adapter for anamorphic, so you can use it on a 16:9 sensor. So you don't necessarily need to use a camera that has, a 4:3 mode or whatever for anamorphic. You can still get that sort of anamorphic look at 1.33 times. And there's also a focal reducer? I can't remember what you actually call those things, but you can put it onto a full frame sensor. Obviously, you lose a stop of light. But again, versatile. Those two adapters are not out yet, but they will be coming, I think, in the next couple of months.
Yeah, and I mean, you were talking about Super 35 and that size and lenses, and 133 anamorphics are obviously a great fit for those cameras. And even on the lower end, we're seeing companies like Sirui coming out with their inexpensive anamorphics. It's not quite a 2x anamorphic. There's definitely a difference between putting an Atlas on there and putting a Sirui and doing a 133 versus a 2x. But It does give you a little bit of that magic inside of there, and they're fun to work with when you're talking about $500, $600, $700 US in terms of price. And it seems like, I don't know, because I don't get multiple copies of these, that, when we talk about German and Japanese manufacturers and we talk about glass, there's pretty good consistency copy to copy as soon as you start hitting their higher end lenses, right? You know that if you're going to get a 24-70 or you're going to get a prime lens, that each copy is probably going to be a good copy, and it's rare that you hear that there's a bad Canon lens or a bad Fuji lens or a bad now Sony lens, and some of these other manufacturers are making amazing glass. It seems like the the Chinese lenses are also becoming pretty consistent in terms of quality compared to even just a few years ago. Are you finding that? I mean, or are you getting a lot of lenses that are coming into Newsshooter and you're saying, I have to send this back because it seems like it's a bad copy? I don't know. Is that a good question? I don't know. Has that ever happened?
Well, I had a Vazen in for review, and I think one of the problems with the Vazen was I think it did a lot of round trips around the country. And so I took it out and I did a lot of testing, and I found that there was some issues with the optics inside. I think it got shuffled around too much. So I contacted them and I said, hey, we're having some problems. I don't know if you can mark that up as like build quality or not. I like the lens, but again, you kind of wonder, well, like you're just saying, how much build quality is going in to the product at that price point. I mean, as soon as you pull it out of the box, it probably worked great. What type of longevity are you going to get for your, bang for your buck on these lenses? And I'm not saying that the Vazen anamorphic was garbage in any sense. I thought it was really nice, and I do believe that it got beat up a little bit in transport, because we all know, UPS and FedEx aren't gonna, handle this thing like it's a precious cinema lens. So that's real possible. But I didn't end up getting another version to retest with. So unfortunately, that kind of review just kind of sat there, and I didn't get it out.
Got it. Better than DHL most of the time, at least here in the States, but it still can be a problem. Okay, cool. So I don't know if it's an elephant in the room, but we obviously have one other thing to talk about before we head over to Panasonic S5 land. And this is, I guess, the little camera that could or should. Over on my channel, we have a weekly live stream, Camera and Flask, and somebody who was in there probably over a month ago called the FX6, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, we've got the FS7. I don't always understand the naming conventions of these cameras, but then we jump to the FX9. We have the FS5. So instead of jumping from 7 to 9, why don't we just go from 5 to 6? Again, there's no logic there, but it would be confusing if you called it the FX7 because of the FS7. So maybe that's why they went that route. Do we have any concrete information about this camera besides what we see here and that it's being listed on B&H's website as a non-orderable item? Gentlemen, talk to me. I'm putting a 2 up of you guys to tell me about this.
Well, I think we can verify that it's gray-ish in color. It has buttons. Lots of buttons on the side. I think it'll probably have like with most cameras, right? You think about, well, what was a little bit weak, or what could be added to a new model to make it better. And I think probably the number one question I had even before we started was like, hey guys, does anybody know if this is a full frame camera or not? And the answer was maybe. I don't know. We don't know. But I think that would be really interesting. I don't know. I'm curious, Matt, what would you think that if it's not a full frame camera, that would sort of be a miss on Sony's part?
I'd say 90% it is a full frame camera. Normally when companies are developing cameras, they are developing more than one model at the same time. And to me, I'd say the FX6 was developed at the same time as the FX9. They've just held out. So I'd imagine it's using probably the exact same sensor as the FX9. It'll be interesting to see what they do in terms of differentiating those two cameras, because obviously they're two different models. So what does Sony now do? I mean, typically Sony, if you look at the FS7 Mark II and the FS5 and FS5 Mark II, they were fairly dumbed down. You know, particularly the FS5 series was fairly dumbed down compared to the FS7. There was a big difference in image quality, and obviously you were limited to HDMI and 420 and all sorts of different things with the FS5 series. So what does Sony do now is the big question. Do they hinder the FX6 or do they sort of swing for the fences, because they really have to compete with Canon now, and Canon has upped their game and put a lot more features and performance into their lower end cameras. So what does Sony have to do now? I don't think they can make like a dumbed down version of an FX9. They've got to offer a lot of what's possibly in the FX9. And I'd say, to not upset FX9 users, it would not surprise me if they start adding additional features into the FX9, which is something that they did a lot with the F5 and F55. So originally at launch, both of those cameras had a certain amount of specifications and promises, and then Sony actually went above that down the line, started adding a lot of features that were never promised at launch. So to differentiate those two cameras, and I think with the release of the Canon C300 Mark II, I think Sony's probably got to improve the FX9 a little bit, but it'll be interesting to see what they put in the FX6 here. I would imagine that also price-wise, looking at the pricing structure of where the FX9 is and the A7S3, is you're probably going to find a mid-ground in there. So the price is going to be somewhere between an A7S3 and somewhere between an FX9. So in that middle section there. So I don't know, probably, $6,000 or around that sort of area, I would expect it to cost.
It would be also interesting to see if they're going to go the route of actually making sure that all their cameras from the Venice all the way to the FX9, that they match, color-wise. There's always been a little bit of a differentiation between those cameras. I never really understood that. More so, I can understand the Venice having its own look, because that's a high-end cinema camera. But, the FX9 and the FS5 or whatever, those cameras should match, because they are designed to be used together, right? And same with, throwing in the new A7S, 3. That should match color science-wise. So I really think, it's hopefully, if Sony does do that, I think it's going to make a lot of people happy to just be able to really have a B cam or even a C cam at this point, that they're all going to play really well together, and you can hand off your shots to someone and not have to be too concerned about getting easily matching these cameras. Also, that electronic ND in the FS5 was pretty darn cool. So that might just develop some more. I think there's some room for improvement on that, as well as autofocus. The other camera just didn't have it very well, very good autofocus. I could definitely see that as being a big improvement and a selling, big selling bullet point for it.
Yeah, it's interesting. If we look at the history of the A7 series, the A7S3 is the big leap forward. But it's a 12 megapixel sensor. And then we have the FX9, which obviously has a much higher megapixel sensor. Both are full frame cameras. So the question is, does Sony take the innards as it did with the FS5 and put the A7 series into that, which is effectively what the FS5 and FS5 II were A7 series innards in a shrunken down FS7 body? Or do they borrow from both? Or do they really just take the FX9 and create a less capable version of that camera? My hope would be, looking at that tier of space, that I want the sensor from the FX9 in the FX6, because those are the two cameras that I would think about possibly matching more for day-to-day production, and then an A7S3 being more specialty, or just somebody's primary camera for certain types of things that people are doing nowadays. Any feelings on that before we hop on to another camera?
I always liked the body size of the FS5. I always thought it was small, easy to work with style. So if they can keep it small, also, I think that would be a big bonus.
I think the hint is in the name, actually. Sony's doing a rebranding, so it's no longer they're calling things Cine Ultra. They're now calling these cameras Cinema Line. And so in that Cinema Line, you're going to have FX6, FX9, and the Venice. So to me, that sort of indicates that the FX6 is going to be more along the lines of the FX9 than it will the A7S3.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's just so many cameras right now. And,
Really?
you know, and Tyler Stallman is saying, after the announcements of 2020, I wonder if next year will be extremely quiet. I don't know. It's amazing how many cameras we're getting here.
It probably will, because we always have that. I mean, like, right, Matt, when we go to these NAB shows and it's a big camera year and we're like, wow, man, this was a great NAB. And then 2-3 years down the road, it's like, oh man, this show's kind of like, there's nothing exciting about it. That's like last year, like when we had 5 new cameras. And so, yeah, that's probably a good assumption that we might have a dry year next year. Also, you know, next week was supposed to be IBC, so there's not really a surprise that we're seeing all these releases, because this is very typical, right, in the trade show circuit to start having pre-releases prior to the show. So I guess it kind of still is happening. There's more to come.
Is there? We know that IBC is a virtual show this year, and so was NAB, and we don't know how next year will play out, but the longer we get into this year, the further we get into this year, the more likely it seems that shows will not happen in person again next year, at least in the beginning of the year into the spring. Should these camera manufacturers have waited on these cameras, or do you think it's right for them to be announcing now, or do you think that one company decided to announce and everybody is now just saying, well, now we have to announce what we've been working on? Any feelings on that from either of you? Matt, you have any feelings on that?
I don't think so. I mean, these cameras just aren't pulled out of thin air. There's a lot of development and research that goes into them. So a lot of these cameras have been in the pipeline for, 2, 3, maybe longer years. So maybe they could hold off on releasing, but I think, everybody is obviously looking very closely at each other in the competition, and you can't be late to the party anymore with cameras. We've seen that happen in the past, where if you release a model too late, I mean, it happened a lot with the C300 Mark II. Sony came in and released the FS7, and then they took a lot of original C300 users and converted them over to the Sony platform. So you can't be late to the party, as I said. I think you need to release something when your competition releases it, and I think that's why we're seeing, potentially the FX6 and this rumored Canon camera that will probably pop up, around the same sort of time. So they're going backwards and forwards, and it's going to be interesting to see if this sort of continues. I don't think, it's necessarily the best time to be marketing new gear, because a lot of people in our industry are struggling financially, and they're going to second guess whether they need to go and buy something. But these camera companies and other manufacturers who are making equipment are there, and they've got a strategy in place and a timeline that they're trying to keep, because they're already working on stuff in advance that, we'll see in another couple of years. So they don't want to have to push that back and push their entire timeline further down the track. So they just have to release them when they do, and whether they sell in large numbers, it'll be interesting to see.
Eric, do you think there's a benefit to... There's no benefit to what's happening in the world right now, but do you think there's a benefit to us if next year winds up being a quiet year, that we get to see all of these cameras get announced? We all get to stand back a little bit and say, okay, production's starting to ramp up again, and we all get to make our decisions in terms of what system we're going to go into. Is there a potential benefit there for us?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of it, really. Like Matt said, this cycle, this thing is moving forward. You can't just stop it. I mean, we could shut down the economy in your city and your state, and you can't go to a restaurant, right, during the pandemic. But these things, like Matt said, they're developed over years, and they have a release schedule, and they're not going to just like skip it, right? So if they're already got the manufacturing ready to go, and then they can't just stockpile a bunch of cameras and a bunch of lenses and lighting equipment, and you just I think you just have to release them, and then and with the mindset of that, look, when this is over, this is the piece of kit that I'm going to buy when I'm ready to get back at it again. And you want to be the company that's going to be the first look, the one that you're, the one you want to go for. So there's a lot at stake in that too, because once, sort of things, I don't know, go back to normal, if that is even possible, you're going to want to already kind of have a pretty good idea of what you want to get.
Cool.
Sorry, Jem. Just one last comment there. I think in some ways for the consumer, out there, it's actually probably a good thing, because you're having all these camera releases, but now people who are not necessarily going to go out and buy them straight away get a chance to wait and have a look to see what the competition's bringing out, and to have a look at a bunch of different reviews and make a more educated, I think, decision about buying a piece of equipment or a camera, instead of just rushing out there like probably people did previously in the past, where something got announced and they clicked buy straight away. So in that regard, I think it's probably good for everybody, because we get a chance to actually take in everything and have a bit of a closer look, and then we can make that informed decision when we're ready.
Yeah, I agree. And it historically, it hasn't been unheard of that camera manufacturers will be very aggressive against each other in terms of programs to get into cameras as well. So we see some comments right now about, can we spend the money, the COVID situation, everything, but sometimes they'll offer a 18 months interest free and things like that, so that they can allow people to start to get into a camera system. Maybe they delay payments. Who knows what those programs are going to be? They're already happening in industries like the car industry, to incentivize people to come in and actually purchase a car or lease a car. So I think it'll be interesting to see where it goes. Speaking of creativity and gear, even though we weren't speaking about either of those things, well, we're always talking about gear. We have to have a show here. So this particular show, episode 2, is being sponsored by the good company that is Rode Microphones. And every year they have a competition called My Rode Reel. If you don't know about it, then you have not been around for a while, or whatever. But it's huge. It's over $1 million in United States currency that can be won in different categories. And you do a short film. You have to do a BTS of using at least one piece of Rode gear. You submit it by October 7th, 2020 Australian time. So if you're in a different time zone, remember that Australia is in the future. Matt, even though he lives in Japan, is Australian, so he actually is technically from the future as well, and he lives in Japan, which is in the future. It's all very confusing. Go to myrodereel.com. That's my spiel. It sounds ridiculous, but they're a sponsor and we like them. And I'm back. Do it. I was a judge years ago for My Rode Reel. Yeah.
They're in the future, Jem. Come on. You can win money, cash prizes from the future.
From the future. Can you imagine? There's a lot of good stuff there and some good judges, and I've seen some of that content over the years, and there's some really creative stuff. There's definitely a quality there. It's not just make a home movie, for sure. So if you're an aspiring filmmaker, if you're an existing filmmaker, if you have a story to tell in short form, go check it out. And it is actually the largest short film competition in the world now, and it's big. There's some serious stuff going on. All right, we're at the halfway mark. It's time to talk about this little camera that we know Matt Allard has had some time with, because you posted an article today after the embargo. You obviously had some time with a pre-production model. So I'm probably going to start with you. We're going to start to bring up some still images, and we're going to talk about this Panasonic S5. And I'll just have you start talking about it, and it's going to be a 2-up, and you gentlemen just start going, and then I'll keep showing pictures of the camera from different angles and just start making comments, and then I'll just keep looking if you have a question in the chat at Newsshooter before your question, and we'll fire some questions off too so we can get those answered about the camera. So let's just take a look at the body here. This is obviously a full frame mirrorless camera system. I don't know if it's a big sibling to the GH5 or it's a little sibling to the S1H. I'll let Matt start with some stuff having to do with that. Matt, how about you start talking as we start to look over this camera body and tell us a little bit about your thoughts.
Yeah, the S5 was officially announced today. And, you know, the name S5 obviously resonates with people who know about the GH5. Now, just to be completely clear up front, this is not a GH5 replacement, and Panasonic is not cancelling the GH line. That's not being phased out. I just wanted to make that crystal clear at the top. So the whole reason behind the S5 is that Panasonic did a lot of market research after they released the S1, the S1R and the S1H. And they found out things that people liked about their cameras and things that they didn't like. And one of the big things was physical size and weight. So the S1, the S1R, and particularly the S1H are a lot larger cameras in terms of size and weight than most of the competition. So what Panasonic have done here is they sort of went back to the drawing board and they came out with a new Lumix S full frame sensor camera that is basically sort of the same sort of size and weight as an A7 III, a Nikon Z6, and a Canon EOS R. Now, those are the three cameras it's designed to compete against. This is not a high-end full-frame mirrorless camera that's designed to compete against a Canon Canon, what do you call it? What's the name of that camera?
EOS R.
Oh, EOS R.
R5.
EOS R. No,
the R5.
R5.
Sorry, the R5.
R5.
The R5.
Yes.
I was
Yes.
getting confused by models. Apologies. The R5 or something like the A7S III. This is a sub $2,000 camera. And in a lot of ways, you can see it there. This is against comparing it against the S1H. So you can see just how much smaller physically.
And it is so much smaller.
The camera is.
I mean, really small.
It's smaller than the GH5.
In the hand, it's a lot more comfortable. Yeah, it actually weighs less and is actually slightly smaller physically than the GH5, which is a pretty good thing, I think, for Panasonic. I mean, my only concern really with this camera is it potentially like a little bit late to the party. This is probably the camera Panasonic should have released instead of the original S1. And in a lot of ways, this is sort of a good complement, and it's a mini S1H. You're not getting all of the functionality of the S1H, but you're getting, 80-85% of it for sort of half the money. So, the big thing that makes this camera stand out is it actually does 422 10-bit up to 30p internally, and it'll also do 420 10-bit up to 60p internally, but that's with an APS-C crop. Now, in any of these 422 10-bit modes, so I guess we'll bring up a slide here, Jem, there is going to be some recording limitations in terms of time. Anything where you're recording UHD 422 10-bit, you're going to be limited to that 29 minutes, 59 seconds. Also, if you're doing the 420 10-bit 60 up to 60p, you're going to have those limitations as well. So if you want to record unlimited, you have to do that in the 420 8-bit modes. Also, you can see on there's anamorphic modes, which is nice. So it basically gets almost all of the anamorphic modes that you can do on the S1H. The only real difference there is that it's limited in NTSC mode to 30p in anamorphic, whereas on the S1H you can do up to 48 frames per second. But if you switch over to PAL frame rates, you can do up to 50p anamorphic in 3328 by 2496, which is exactly the same as you can do in the larger S1H. And just talking about the NTSC PAL on the old S1, the biggest problem is that wasn't a PAL or NTSC switchable camera. If you bought one of those, you had to buy it in whatever market you were operating in. And if you were in America, you got an NTSC model. If you were in Europe, you got a PAL model. So the S5 is fully PAL NTSC switchable. And what's really nice is that you can actually just go in there and switch automatically, and the camera doesn't actually have to reboot. Even on the S1H, if you have to change the system frequency to change between PAL and NTSC frame rates, you need to go in there and change it, and then the camera needs to reboot. So that's just something that's been added that's quite interesting. I mean, I could talk about this camera for ages, but I'll ask some questions, or if people in the chat have got something that they want to specifically know, I'll try and answer it.
I do find it
Yeah.
interesting that how small it is. And we can go back to that idea. That thing is the same size as a GH5 with a full frame sensor, and it apparently doesn't have any heating issues. So that's pretty impressive how they were able to pull that off, because it's a big sensor and it's doing some higher quality codecs as well. And it's also interesting that it doesn't do 24p. Not that 23976 is pretty darn close. I actually end up shooting that a lot for broadcast because I think it kind of converts better to when I export it out for 2997. But I was surprised it doesn't do 24. But again, super small camera. Also, the S1, like you said, that they did the market research, and they probably were struggling with the idea of actually, bringing out a camera that's going to be priced the same as one that they had already developed. But I think that was a real brave and smart move. Even if they decide to keep the S1 around, that's at that same price. I don't know how many people are going to want to buy that camera compared to the S5. I didn't do a side-by-side, Matt, but is there a real reason why you would not want the S5 over the S1?
No, not really. I mean, I asked Panasonic this as well, and I thought, is this an S1 replacement? They're like, no, the S1 will continue in the line. And then I asked, well, is the S1 going to get a price drop? Because obviously these cameras are priced about the same sort of money. So why would you take the S1 over the S5? And that's a good question. I can't see a reason why you would probably take the S1 over the S5 at this point in time, particularly if you're looking at a Panasonic Lumix camera. So it'll be interesting to see. They said the price wouldn't drop on the S1, but the market pressure could obviously change that, and you may well find that the S1 is available for slightly cheaper. I mean, the S1 again was one of those cameras that was sort of a little hindered, and you had to pay for that sort of upgrade key, which is similar to what they had with the GH5 in terms of wanting to get Vlog and 422 10-bit 60 out. Those are things that are obviously included in the S5 that you don't have to pay for. The other thing too with the S5 is it's got that dual native ISO, so it's exactly the same. I mean, Panasonic won't tell you this officially, but I'm almost 95% sure that this is the exact same sensor that's in the S1H, because it features the same dual native ISO at the same levels. The only real difference there is that on the S1H you can switch between either having it set on auto or on low or high to change those where the dual gain circuitry comes in. With the S5, that's not possible. There's only an auto mode, so it automatically switches at some point, and that depends on what picture profile you're shooting in. If you're shooting in Vlog, it happens at certain ISOs. If you're shooting in other picture profiles, it changes. So you just need to be aware of that, that your dual base ISOs change depending on what picture profile you're shooting in.
I was trying to mute my audio because an airplane was going overhead, but that's what happened. Yeah, so I guess you're already answering Chris's question, which is there any reason to get an S1 now? Does the S1, I mean, I don't know if either of you even know the answer to this, but the data rates are not extremely high in this camera. From when I was looking at your specs on the article, it looks like in anamorphic you're getting the highest data rate that's possible, which I believe is 200 megabits per second. And it seems that in most situations that sweet spot is 150 megabits per second, which is not unusual with these cameras nowadays. C200 is similar, though that's 8-bit, according to the SD cards. So does the S1 have some higher data rates like the S1H? Is that maybe something that differentiates it, or it doesn't, and the data rates and the formats and stuff are similar? Right? If you don't know, it's fine, but that's the only thing I could think of.
No idea, to be honest. I don't know that much about the S1. I think in the article there's a comparison there on one of the tables in my review that lists the different data rates. And I think maybe I put the S1. I'm not sure. Maybe someone in the chat knows. I'm not sure.
Okay, and then and is there anything from a stills capability that make the S1 a more compelling camera to the S5? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about either of those cameras to know, but I'm just trying to figure out how they're pricing those two cameras the same. I'm assuming that they're going to give the upgrade for free at some point. If it's not, if it's still, is it still paid?
Not for the S5. I
Yeah.
don't know about the S1.
No, but is it still a paid upgrade on the S1 as of right now, as of today?
Yes. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I really think that market research, they just said, "Oh, the heck with it. Let's just make this camera. And we'll let the market decide what to buy." Now, they also, I saw some samples of that slow and fast, or what do they call it, slow and quick, S&Q.
Yeah, S&Q. Yep.
That's a nice feature on the dial. Super fast. You don't have to go into the menu, man. I mean, it's always kind of frustrating when you're trying to switch, to a faster, like more frame rates, higher frame rates. But I also noticed that the quality isn't all that great with the S5. Did you find that an issue, Matt, when you were testing it?
With the S&Q modes, yes, once you get up to those higher frame rates, obviously it's only in HD, and I think it's only 420 8-bit from memory. And, it's okay at sort of like, 75, 100 frames per second, but as soon as you sort of go above 120, it starts getting pretty soft. So you can get up to 150 frames per second in HD. Obviously, the autofocus will work at 150, but once you get over, I think 152, that disables, and you'll also get an additional crop between 152 and 180 frames per second, where it's slightly cropped in. And yeah, it is. I mean, it is noticeably softer. It's not something you would want to use with a lens that wasn't particularly sharp, and you probably wouldn't want to be doing it in an environment where you had to push the ISO too high. I mean, it's nice to have, but I mean, it is a little bit soft. And just before we jump back to you, Jem, I'll just talk, because Eric was talking about, no overheating. And the thing is, the S5, yes, it will overheat in certain conditions, like all full frame mirrorless cameras will. Panasonic told me that they do a lot of research in terms of making sure that a camera meets a particular standard. So the camera has to operate up to an ambient temperature of, I believe it's 30 something degrees Celsius or 104 Fahrenheit, where they do a lot of testing, and that's where the camera limitations come in. So that recording limitation, it's probably a combination of a technical reason where they feel, things are getting too hot, and that's the limit we can sort of put it at. And it's probably also, something to differentiate it from the S1H as well. Maybe the camera can record for longer. I mean, who knows? But it's, it's Panasonic's prerogative to obviously have market segmentation, and they can't give you all the features of a $3,800 camera and a $2,000 camera. So I was interested to see if this camera would overheat. So it's really hot here in Japan at the moment. So I put it outside in its 422 10-bit mode with the IBIS going, and also continuous autofocus. And I left it outside. Now, outside it was 36 degrees centigrade. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. That's probably 110 or something, somewhere around that sort of area. I don't know, maybe a little bit less. But the thing is, that's just the ambient temperature. Anything that's left... Whoops, I've knocked my microphone over. Apologies.
It happens.
Anything that's left outside is going to obviously get hotter, because the buildup of the temperature on the surface, just like, the surface of the asphalt on the road on a 30-degree day is more probably like 60 degrees. So I left it out there recording. And then I got about, I think, 19 minutes, 45 seconds before a temperature warning came on, and it actually shut off. But the outside of the temperature of the camera was so hot from the outside air, and it's sitting on the ground there, that I could barely touch it. It was that hot. So when I brought it back inside and then I turned it back on, the temperature warning had gone instantly. I could record straight away. There was no downtimes or anything like that. So I pressed record again instantly. And I got about, I think, 9 minutes of time before then that temperature icon came back on again. But it didn't stop recording. It kept going until the end of the 29:59 second thing. And then it's obviously stopped recording. And then the temperature gauge went off. So the temperature gauge there, I think, is there as a warning for you to say, hey, look, things are getting a little bit hot here. It's probably not good long-term for your camera to just leave it on here recording. But it didn't just sort of shut off. So,
Sure.
I guess if you're in a situation where you're outside and it's hot and you're recording, you probably want to keep that clip going. If it's the middle of an interview or something where it's going, even if the recording indicator comes up, it gives you that ability to keep rolling and get that, and then actually, stop the recording instead of it just switching off midway. But, all mirrorless full frame cameras that are weather sealed, that don't have a fan are going to overheat in certain conditions, and you just need to be aware of that.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. And the one thing about it too is, you know, you were trying to break it, right? So you're out there testing it to find it to a, you know, no pun intended, but it's boiling point, and that's important to do. I don't know if, you know, maybe that camera wouldn't overheat if you were running around, stopping recording, you know, moving to another location, getting some shade on it, you know, all these things, knowing that you could have problems, you know, you could work around it a little bit. And one thing I do want to ask you, Matt, because I know this is a big stickler with most of the Panasonic cameras, is that the autofocus performance is just not at a level competing with, you know, Canon and Sony, probably even, you know, Nikon at this point. I didn't see any real improvement in the S5, and I'm kind of surprised that Panasonic seems to be just not able to increase the performance. Now, also, I noticed that in still mode, it looked like it was actually performing better in autofocus than in video mode, which is odd. Well, not so odd.
Well, it's still a contrast-based system. I mean, they haven't changed it completely. So it's literally the same system that's in the S1 or the S1H, but they've tweaked, obviously, the algorithms in there. I mean, it's sort of limited as to what they can do, but compared to the S1H, it is a big improvement. The S1H autofocus is pretty horrible. You can see in the review there, I've got a couple of examples there where I was just doing the face and eye tracking, literally sitting in almost the same place as I am here, to see the difference between the S1H and the S5 in terms of that tracking performance. And you can see how much slower it is on the S1H, and times when it just loses it completely and everything goes out of focus. Now, from the tests I did as well, I also did a comparison test against the EOS R. So to make it fair, because the EOS R only does UHD in an APS-C crop, I put the S5 into an APS-C crop as well, and, you know, did a couple of shots outside, and also had, you know, came straight towards camera at speed. And it was interesting to see in the APS-C mode that the S5 did a pretty good job compared to the Canon. I mean, it does lose it slightly when you're running towards camera in the middle. It's not as fast as responding as obviously Canon's system. And then you also get this, you know, the contrast-based problem of this sort of throbbing of the background, or it's trying to settle on something, which is a bit of a problem. I mean, it works okay. Would I use it in a professional environment? No, I don't think I would. I think you'd be gambling with it, because if it goes off, it goes off. And particularly if you're running this as a second camera, for instance, that's unmanned, I wouldn't rely on that autofocus to be tracking heads and eyes. It's okay if somebody's just sitting still, but if someone's moving around, you know, it can struggle. And this is the biggest problem that Panasonic faces, is that, you know, the competition is ahead of them in terms of autofocus performance, particularly with video. And this is the biggest stumbling block for Panasonic in trying to get people to use their cameras, is that, you know, there's only a limited amount of Lumix S glass that's out there at the moment too. And if you're going to spend money on some glass that can only be used on these, you know, currently on these 3 mirrorless cameras at this time, you're not going to want to spend a heap of money to get subpar sort of autofocus performance. But if you're someone who just uses manual focus all the time and wants to use, you know, different lenses through the use of adapters, then, you know, the S5 makes a lot of sense.
Now, the GH5 actually performed better in 60p than it did at 24p. Did you see the similarity with the S5 as well?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, the faster the frame rate, the better the autofocus will obviously work. I think it's, you know, when you're shooting, let's say 23.98 or 29.98p or whatever, then, you know, the read speed of the sensor and the way the contrast-based autofocus works, you know, it's quite slow. That's why, you know, in stills, it's obviously a lot better, because it's, you know, if you're running a higher shutter speed or whatever, for instance, it can scan it a lot quicker, and the autofocus works a lot better. As soon as you have those lower frame rates and lower shutter speeds, you know, that autofocus is going to struggle a little bit. So, you know, they're sort of stuck with this at the moment. I mean, to their credit, the S1, the S1R, and the S1H are all going to get this upgrade. It's just going to be a firmware upgrade that's going to change the autofocus performance and put it on par with what you're seeing on the S5.
So the other question I had for you, Matt, which I think was in the article, is it seems that there's no low pass filter on the S5. Is that true? And did you, especially when you started to do high frame rate stuff and some tests, were you seeing some moire, and were there issues with that at all?
I didn't seem to notice too much of a difference, to be honest. I mean, I'd have to test it a little bit more thoroughly to have I think, a conclusive view on that. One of the things I did notice, and this seems to be an inherent problem with a lot of the Panasonic cameras, even the EVA1 and the S1H as well, is that you do occasionally get this blue channel bleed. I know they've addressed it in the past with firmware upgrades, but there was a couple of instances where outside, and I didn't notice it until I had it sort of stopped on a frame when I was actually editing up the material, is that when you get sort of very bright clipping backgrounds or anywhere where it sort of exceeds 100 IRE and you start getting very hard clipping, you do occasionally see this bleeding on the blue channel where you can see it quite clearly in one of the shots. I think I put it on the site there too, is up in the left-hand corner near my head. You'll see that you'll see this strange sort of blue outline around something where it's just, white sky basically, because it's blown out, which shouldn't be there. And then if you look on an RGB parade, you'll actually see above the clipping, you'll see these tiny little peaks that are popping up, just showing that there's chroma bleed happening there. Again, I mean, everything you're seeing on this is a pre-production version of the camera that I was testing. So, take it with a grain of salt. Whether these things get improved before it actually gets released, I'm not sure. I just thought I'd bring that up because it was something that I saw, and maybe people want to be aware of it because it is something that has happened on Panasonic cameras in the past.
Cool. So one thing to just mention here, if you do go to Newsshooter, there is actually a forum. And if you want to continue conversations or start up conversations related to gear, go and check that out. And of course, the full S5 review from Matt Allard, which is on the site now. Now, one thing is for sure, as we start to wrap up this show, there are a lot of people who are in this industry or who are creators, content creators, storytellers, that over time have gone from one camera manufacturer to another, sometimes back to the camera manufacturer. And I don't think that it's uncommon right now for a lot of people to have more than one camera manufacturer's cameras in their arsenal as in terms of their kit. And sometimes that's also in a rental situation. And that means that, you might have a C200, but you also have an A7 III or whatever that situation is. So I think it's only come to mind because at the beginning of the chat, I saw that Film Convert is there. It'll be interesting to see how companies like Film Convert allow content creators to use cameras from different manufacturers and have them work well together. I know that they have some solutions there. They're not a sponsor. I've been really interested in trying that because I'm finding that and even if you're in the same company, there's different sensors in these cameras. Arri is the one big exception there, that they are putting the same sensor in all of their cameras, and everybody else is saying, okay, well, we've got this sensor in this camera and we've got another camera that's only $2,000 more or less, but there's a different sensor in there. So even if you're using the same gamma, and all of those things in the camera, it's very hard unless they spend a lot of time testing these things to make these cameras match in even the same camera manufacturers. So I think that'll be an interesting conversation going forward. Is how do we how do we make our lives a little bit easier? Sometimes we can't go buy 2 or 3 of the same camera. It's just not possible. Any parting words from you gentlemen for this week before we let Eric go and escape this insanity and go on vacation?
If my internet connection stays any, I might be gone sooner. I mean, I look like I'm underwater over here. Actually, what I'm really, we haven't talked about this, and we don't have time to talk about it, but it's something to think about. The Evo 1 has been around for a while, and it has not really had a lot of updates, and or even a new camera that we have to replace it. So I'm wondering, what's Panasonic doing in that, and also Vericam's kind of due for maybe an update or two. So Panasonic, maybe we'll see something from them in the late part of September. We'll see, maybe. Who knows?
Yeah, be interesting. It's definitely time. I mean, if you look at the timeline of these other manufacturers, that EVA one's been around for a while. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Matt, what you got for us from the future? What words from the future do you have? Tell us. Wise words
from the future.
You know things that we don't know already, so just tell us something.
I mean, I'll keep mentioning it over and over again. Don't buy gear for the sake of buying gear. If you've got equipment now that works well for what you're doing and your clients are happy with it, or produces good results, don't feel the need to go and buy something new. I mean, that probably sounds strange coming from a website that talks a lot about equipment, but there's no need to buy something if you've got something that already works well for you.
Yeah. Well, the purpose of Newsshooter is not for people to buy gear. It's to give them information so they can make informed decisions that when they do buy it or rent it, that they can do that with some clarity. But I think you've said it many times before, don't take one review as the gospel, as the word of what you should and shouldn't do. And I think that's very, very good advice. Last question. It's for you, Matt, from Chris. What's the robot's name from Matt's reviews?
I know someone said he should have his own IMDb page because he's been on so many credits on there. He doesn't actually have a name. It's actually strange. I should probably give him a name. I mean, I just use him because he's an interesting character because it's very good for showing up fine detail, and he has this very, very finite pattern on the metal there, which people are sometimes confused with being moire or artifacts when it actually isn't. So I do it because it's a good sort of benchmark whenever I test a lens, particularly, or some cameras, to see what the resolving detail is or anything like that. So it gives me a reference. So every time I do a lens or a camera, I can show the exact same thing. So then it also tells me how well that lens or camera is performing because I'm doing it on the exact same object.
Do you have a backup, Mr. Roboto, or is that the only one?
I only have the one robot there. I do have a couple of filming Smurfs. There's one with a clapperboard and one with a camera. They're around somewhere, but I haven't put. They're a little bit hard for unless you're using a macro lens because they're only about this big. So the robot's a little bit.
My favorite are the eyeballs that you put on the windscreens. That's my favorite.
Maybe we'll have a contest to name the robot. Chris is going to call him Johnny 5 for now. Johnny and 5. With that, ladies, gentlemen, kids, people of Earth, thank you for episode 2. Thank you for coming. Erik, have a great time on your vacation. You will be back not next week, but the week after. So we're only going to miss you for 1 week. Matt and I are going to work with the Newsshooter team to try to find a host, a panelist. What do you call it? What are you guys? You're the voices of Newsshooter. Somebody else to come on and hang out with us. And I'm hoping that we also, as we start to do more of these, have guests that come on, especially when we start to see new announcements, new cameras come out, because it's great to talk about our experiences with these things, but I think we need some additional voices in here at times as well. Take care of yourself, keep creating, and we'll see you next week on Newsshooter Weekly. Thank you, everybody. Take care.